Hey everybody, and welcome back to the third episode of Think Like a Pro, where in this episode we're going to talk about card advantage. So let's go ahead and just jump right in. What is card advantage? Card advantage is whenever you're able to outvalue your opponent by either gaining more cards after an action, or making your opponents lose more cards after an action. There's three questions you can ask yourself to find out if the action that just happened gained you card advantage or not. Question number one is how many cards did this action cost you? Question number two is how many cards did you gain or keep after the action? And question number three is how many cards did your opponents lose after this action? Typically, if the number of cards you gained or kept is higher than you lost, or if the number of cards your opponent lost is higher than the amount of cards that you lost, that usually means that you came out ahead in card advantage. So let's go ahead and just jump right into our first example. In our first example, we're going to talk about a scenario where I gained card advantage by gaining more cards after an action than I started with. So to start this example off, let's go ahead and count how many cards I have in my hand. So if you see here, I'm starting with one card on the battlefield, but 6 cards in my hand. Now, I'm going to play the Poro Hoarder. So after I play the Poro Hoarder, I go down to 5 cards in my hand, and then I'm going to draw 2 off of his ability and go up to 7. So after playing the Poro Hoarder, after that action, I effectively gained 1 more card in my hand because now I have 7 cards. So because of that action, I now gained card advantage by having an additional resource, by having an additional card in my hand. And that allows me to have more options to play and more cards to do things with. A big mistake a lot of players make is by thinking the only way to gain card advantage is by drawing cards. But they forget that the cards on the battlefield also count towards card advantage as well. So let's look at an example of what card advantage on the battlefield looks like. Okay, so in this example, we're going to talk about how cards on the battlefield also count towards card advantage, and card advantage is not just by drawing cards or making your opponents discard cards. So, for instance, let's say your opponent has 3 creatures on the board. Now, you play the Ruination. So, after this action, you've spent 1 card, and your opponent has now lost 3 cards. This is what we would call a 3-for-1. So you come out ahead, not because you gained more cards than your opponent after this action of casting Ruination, but because your opponent lost more cards than you after this action. Alright, let's look at another example here on how to gain card advantage in the board state, not through board wipes. So we're going to be looking at a 2-for-1 here. It's where you affect a card both on the battlefield and a card that's in your opponent's hand, and you come out ahead in card advantage. So your opponent attacks you with the Fiora, and you block with the creature that's bigger. Now your opponent decides to cast a riposte on the Fiora to try and kill your creature. Instead, you decide to use Vengeance. And effectively, you end up killing the Fiora, and you wasted your opponent's riposte. So they lost 2 cards in this exchange, whereas you only had to spend 1 card. So this is another example of what we would call a 2-for-1, where you come out ahead in card advantage by spending less resources than your opponent and coming out ahead. We can look again. Let's look at She Who Wanders. Now, She Who Wanders affects both hand and battlefield. Whenever you play She Who Wanders, let's say your opponent has 1 creature on the battlefield that has power 4 or less. They have 2 in their hand. Now, you cast 1 card, so you effectively spent 1 card, and now your opponent has lost 3 cards for it. Again, this is a 3-for-1, and you've come out miles ahead of your opponent as far as card advantage goes. So, don't forget, guys, that card advantage, while mainly done through drawing cards and making your opponent lose cards or discard cards, can also be done through effects like this through the battlefield and by affecting your opponent's board state. Okay, now that you guys understand what card advantage is, let's go ahead and talk about what's not card advantage. Now I'm going to put a couple examples up here on the screen. I'm going to ask you guys a question, let you guys answer it, and after a few seconds I'll go ahead and tell you guys what the answer is. So let's start with Mina Swiftfoot. So here, you play Mina Swiftfoot, and then you bounce 3 of your opponent's enemies back to their hand. Now, is this card advantage? No, this is not card advantage, because you're not actually making your opponent lose cards. What this is called is tempo, which I'll cover in a later video. You see, all you're really doing is just prolonging your opponent to cast these creatures next turn. So, they didn't lose any cards because they just moved from the battlefield to their hand, and they're more than likely just going to play all 3 cards next turn, and you'll be in the exact same spot as you were just in, except now you just have an additional creature on the board. Alright, so for the second example, let's say you attack with the River Shaper, and your opponent blocks with an Arena Rookie. So here, both of your creatures die, but you draw a spell. Now, is this card advantage? Yes, because after the action, both of you lost your creatures on the board, so you both lost 1 card. However, you gained an additional card off of River Shaper's ability, so you came out 1 card ahead of your opponent. For the final example, let's say you attack with the Shadow Assassin and your opponent blocks with an Ash. Now, you cast Glimpse Beyond on your Shadow Assassin and draw 2 cards. Did you just gain card advantage? Technically, no. So, your opponent spent 0 cards in this interaction since the Ash was already on the field. And you lost 2 cards by killing your assassin and casting your Glimpse Beyond, and then you drew 2 cards. You're also at a net 0 for how many cards you gained this turn. So, while you did not gain raw card advantage, you did gain virtual card advantage, which leads me into what virtual card advantage is. The last thing I'm going to touch on is virtual card advantage. Now, virtual card advantage more of an advanced concept, so I'm just going to try and touch on it briefly and not overwhelm you guys while also attempting to explain it in the most simple way possible. So simply put, card advantage, regular card advantage, deals with the raw number of cards that are available to either player. So this is, the actual number of cards in your hand and the actual number of cards on the battlefield. However, virtual card advantage deals with the quality of cards that are available to either player. So, virtual card advantage will mainly be gained in Legends of Runeterra through looting mechanic at the moment. So, this deals with cards like Rummage. At first glance, people think, wait, this card draws you 2 cards. How is this not just card advantage? Well, if you look closer and you count the number of cards you end with, you'll notice that you actually end with less cards than you started with. So, for example, let's say you start with 5 cards in your hand. You now cast Rummage, and at the same time, you have to discard 2 cards. So now you go down to 2 cards in your hand. After you draw the 2 cards from Rummage, you now end the action with 4 cards in hand after everything is resolved. That's 1 less card than you started with. Now, while the raw numbers may make this look like you lost card advantage, you actually gained virtual card advantage by discarding 2 cards that aren't useful in your scenario to try and find 2 cards of better quality that can help you win in your matchup. For instance, if you're in a control matchup and you're playing an aggressive deck, you can discard 2 creature kill spells, since control decks don't typically play creatures, and you can try and find more direct damage that can just kind of blow them up that's more useful to you and has higher quality in that matchup. That's going to be it for this episode of Think Like a Pro. I hope you all enjoyed it and learned the difference between what's card advantage, what's not card advantage, as well as how to gain card advantage over your opponent so you can be ready to dominate Legends of Runeterra. Thank you guys for watching. Make sure if you enjoyed the video to subscribe and leave a comment so I can respond to you guys if you have any questions. I post videos every Wednesday and Saturday, and I stream on Twitch Monday through Friday. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.